Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my January reading minus the dog training books. If you'd like me to do a separate video about the dog training books, let me know. I'm not sure if there's interest in that kind of thing or not. And I started the year by reading Hesiod's Works and Days. This is on theme for that history-themed readathon that's going on, where you have to start the year with something from the ancient world. Hesiod was the first of the ancient Greek poets in the sense that there were probably people writing poetry before, but this is the first thing that was recorded as being by an individual. And the poems in this are the story of Pandora's box. The framework is that he's snarking at his brother for being lazy. This translation is by Stallings, and she does make it rhyme, which it doesn't in the original, but her reasoning for doing that is really interesting. And her introduction to this is fantastic. This is quite short, and the introduction is basically half of this book, and it's well worth reading, even if you've read the poems in different translations, or even in this translation before, but missed the introductory part, because it's great. And one of the things that she does is, she's Canadian but lives in Greece, and she connects basically the culture of ancient Greece and the art and all of that to modern Greece. Because I think there is a habit in Anglophone, Francophone, etc., Western, quote-unquote, countries to talk about ancient Greek work as being the foundation of Western work, and that which takes it out of the context of the Eastern Mediterranean, which is where it comes from. And so it almost pretends that, say, that modern English or French or Italian writing is more the heir of the ancient Greeks than modern Greece, which is ridiculous. And so she puts the ancient Greeks in connection to modern Greece and to culture and to writing and poetry and all of that, and to the literary tradition, both to general culture and to the literary tradition. So I think if you haven't seen a lot of that, and I think it's, especially if you've read a lot of stuff that's in the public domain, and so you're reading a lot of material that is, say, English writers of the Victorian era who do make that separation, I think it's brilliant to see something that allows the ancient Greeks to still be Greek in a way that's connected to the modern country. So I thought that was a lot of fun. I'm not going to say a lot about this because, as I said, it is short, but yeah, well worth reading. Loved the introduction. Great stuff. Forward a couple thousand years, but staying in the Eastern Mediterranean. Next up, I read The Pianist from Syria. Depending on what market you're in, it might be called A Pianist from Yarmouk. If you remember a viral video from about 10 years ago of a man in the ruins outside of Damascus playing a piano in the street, this Aeham Ahmad, that's him. And it details his life growing up in Syria, as well as his father's life. Their family were of Palestinian heritage. They were from a family that had moved just after 1948, but because of Syrian nationality rules, they never had citizenship. And so their political situation was a little more precarious even prior to the war there, which he refers to as a revolution. And this book personalizes a lot of that experience of Palestinians in Syria, of having a music education when you're not from an ultra-wealthy family, because that's quite interesting. He talks about getting into a music school where almost everyone else was very upper class. He talks a bit about his father's musical education, which was only possible because his father was blind and so went to schools for the blind, which had more opportunities for musical education than they would have otherwise. He talks about the successes of a musical instrument business that they'd been working up. And then we get into the war and then his eventual escape to Germany and bringing his family over. Now, this is a book that was written with 2 ghostwriters, and it's also translated. It was originally published in German. And it feels like that in bits because sometimes you do feel like the voice has changed or that there was an outside person entering information that is for an audience that doesn't necessarily understand cultural context or references. And I think that's fine. This is a book that does feel very strongly in points that it is a kind of positive propaganda in the sense that it was telling the original audience, hey, have some good feelings for these refugees, which is fair. It's fine for something to do that. I do think it's interesting this author has another book that's come out now, not in English, but if you read German or Italian, it's, I believe, called Damascus Taxi or Taxi Damascus, something like that. And I'll be curious to look at that just to see if the voice feels different, because I think it has 1 ghostwriter on it, so we have that 1 level, but not the 3 levels that are there in this. I actually think some of that positive propaganda stuff makes it even more interesting, because you can see what's going on, because it is kind of obvious in bits, because you do feel like there's a difference in the voice, and I don't know, I think some of that would have been better served with footnotes, but some people don't like footnotes, so there you go. In any case, I think if you're interested in music and you're curious to read a kind of personal history of recent events in Syria, there you go. All right, let's jump to the other side of the Mediterranean. Next up, I read Leïla Slimani's Sex and Lies. In English, this is subtitled True Stories of Women's Intimate Lives in the Arab World. That is overstating the scope of this. This is a group of stories about women that she met specifically in Morocco, so calling it in the Arab world. No, this is about Morocco, and it's about mostly middle class or sometimes people of slightly lower class, but people who read, because it's all people who contacted Slimani after they read one of her novels that I guess is about somebody with a sex addiction or something like that. I haven't read any of her fiction, so. One of the blurbs on the back describes this as being similar to Svetlana Alexievich's work, and it's not. Because there are bits in this where she allows different people to speak for themselves, but she is constantly commenting on it. So there are sections that could be like an oral history, but you're always getting the author interjecting and commenting on it, and often repeating the same thing over and over, which I don't think the audience needs. It's too heavy-handed, and it's also not letting the women speak for themselves. So I love the idea of this, but just execution-wise, I didn't think it was great. And again, this is because these are people who read her book and reacted to it a specific way. It does have a very one-sided view where the women are always saying, well, everyone believes this. And you do think, I doubt that everyone believes that, because no culture would be so monolithic, even if it's very common. It is still very interesting about how sexuality is dealt with socially, but also legally, because adultery and homosexuality are illegal. But most of the people in here are arguing that they are very common, so people are just paying a lot of bribes. And so there is interesting commentary on that. Was two 60-something conservative politicians who were discovered having an affair, and what that means both in the sense that everybody points and laughs at hypocrisy in situations like that, but also what does it mean that these 60-something people are still having an affair in a parking lot in the way that you would expect teenagers to, and things like that. So this is interesting, but it is frustrating in parts because the author is promising to let different people talk for themselves, and she just doesn't, because she has to interrupt them all the time. And I would far prefer to have seen this broken into, here are the stories, and then here's the author's commentary, rather than the two woven together. I thought that weakened the overall product. And this was translated by Sophie Lewis. We have time, we'll talk about some fiction. Next up, I read a piece of KidLit, and this is Sharon M. Draper's Forged by the Fire. This is one of those books that is kind of an old school, high interest, low ability, in which it is written at maybe a low middle grade level, but it's meant to be for kids who are maybe 12 to 14, maybe even a little older, in which you follow characters who have the worst luck in the world. This is a character where his entire life is a series of tragedies. His mother is a drug addict. His stepfather goes to prison after sexually abusing his sister. He survives one fire. He survives two fires. He's in the custody of his aunt, who's great, and then she dies. Now, I picked this up because I was promised a basketball element, and I enjoy seeing kids' stories where there's a basketball element. That's fairly minor here, although I think the connection in this series is that the kids all play basketball together. Interestingly, this is a very new edition, but this book was published back in the late 90s, and it does feel like a book that was published in the 90s because you do have a lack of cell phones that I think you'd have something now. But this is still very popular with kids in the right age range, and I think there is a certain appeal to following this person who has this terrible, terrible luck in his life and everything that can go wrong. It's funny because any chapter in this could be an entire issue book. But I think this is kind of typical of the high interest, low ability book, in that you have to have a lot of drama to keep the interest up. So it is just the perfect example of that, which does make it a kind of odd thing to read as an adult. So if you are reading it as an adult, I think it helps to think about it from that meta level of how is this going to work for its intended audience rather than reading it for your own enjoyment? Because if you were reading it for your own enjoyment, I think it just is frustrating because it is so over the top almost. So yeah. I saw somebody on Goodreads calling it tragedy porn for children, which, I mean, maybe. It's not untrue, but there we go. And finally, I read Nowhere to Nowhere by Bekim Sejranović. This was translated by Will Firth. This is kind of a fantastic novel about someone who is not likable in the slightest, but is not likable for reasons that are understandable. The main character in this lies constantly, and in some ways it reminded me of Pajtim Statovci's Crossing, except this is much more realistic lying. In that book, there are lies that you think somebody would have called that person out, or that wouldn't have been realistic. This is completely realistic. You can see people buying into the various things that he's saying. And you can imagine somebody lying the way he lies because it just makes sense. The character, similarly to the author, is a Bosnian guy who was in Croatia going to college when the war started in the 90s, and is suddenly left in a position where he is illegally in a country that wasn't even a different country when he moved there. The character then moves to Norway at a point when he couldn't move to a number of other countries because they had cut off Bosnian refugees going to, say, Sweden, so he ends up in Norway because they were still taking people. This is similar to what happened to the author. And it's just talking about how, because of a variety of family dysfunction and just war and international relocation, there's a lot of ridiculousness to his life that makes the truth there is no truth that makes sense. Like when he's talking about nationality, what does it even matter if the country that you grew up in doesn't exist anymore? And would you be defining yourself as belonging to a religion when you grew up under communism and had bought into the atheism of traditional communism and things like that? So it's simultaneously very funny, but also very, oh, this guy is awful because he is lying to his good friends and family and girlfriends and things like that. So it's just kind of delightful and frustrating simultaneously. And I think I had really enjoyed the other book, Crossing, that I talked about, but I think this is even better because something about the believability of the lying just improves this. And just fantastic. Sejranović died 2 years ago. He was in his 40s, which is a shame. This is the only one of his books that's been translated into English. There is one other that's been translated into French. Can't see that. Ton fils, Huckleberry Finn. So I bought that and look forward to reading it. He also did a lot of work translating Norwegian stuff into the Balkan language, which is interesting. And translation actually comes into that novel, and there are sections where he's translating for refugee claimants, and that's all really interesting too. Like it's just a book with different components that are just fantastically engaging, and yeah, just really great stuff. Highly recommended. I don't know how to describe it properly because it really isn't plot-based, even though this is a guy flees the war and goes to Norway, but you jump through time all the time. But the timeline isn't linear. You're always going backwards and forwards and what's happening. So you're at a funeral in a mountain in Bosnia, and suddenly you're a laborer on a ship in Norway, and 10 years later, and goes back and forth. Just really good stuff. I mean, it won't be for anyone who wants likable characters or a linear story, or wants people to have a lesson at the end, because it's not that kind of book. But I think if you're interested in unlikable people in situations that are outside of their control, but their life hasn't been easy, but they're making their own life harder too, that's this kind of story. All right, so that is most of what I read in January, other than the dog stuff. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.